I was sitting in my office late last night, the blue light of my monitor reflecting off a cold cup of coffee, scrolling through the usual breaking news alerts. On the surface, the world seemed to be exhaling. Headlines were plastered with the word ceasefire, and the State Department was busy broadcasting a rare, polished optimism about the U.S.-Iran negotiations. For a fleeting second, if you ignored the history of the last decade, you could almost believe that the gears of diplomacy were finally grinding toward peace. But I've stopped looking at official press releases to understand the world. They've become a form of performance art. Instead, I opened a tab for Polymarket. I've developed this habit of checking prediction markets as a sort of honesty filter for global stability. There is something uniquely transparent about a betting slip. In a world of deepfakes, the only thing that doesn't lie is a person's willingness to lose money on a wrong guess. Most of the volume was predictable, people hedging bets on oil prices or the duration of the truce. But then I stumbled upon a niche contract that made me lean in. It wasn't about policy. It was a simple binary yes-no on whether the Iranian diplomatic delegation currently in Pakistan would be physically neutralized before the summit's conclusion. I watched the price flicker ticks of red and green as anonymous accounts moved thousands of dollars. It was a cold, clinical representation of a human life reduced to a $0.15 payout. What struck me wasn't just the cynicism of the bet, but the realization that the negotiating table has been fundamentally transformed. It's no longer a sanctuary where enemies try to find a way out. It's become a target acquisition environment. We've entered a new normal where the invitation to talk is often just a tactical ruse to fix a target's coordinates. It raises a haunting question. How did we reach a point where diplomacy is used as bait and the death of a messenger is just another tradable commodity?
Wow. Yeah, it's an incredibly heavy thought to start with, but it's exactly where we are right now.
Right. And that is exactly what we are getting into today. We're doing a deep dive into how statecraft has essentially been weaponized. We're pulling from a variety of security reports, historical case studies, and, analyses of financial prediction markets to really look at how this anti-assassination norm just completely evaporated. And our mission today is to figure out what happens to international relations when, the leaders who are supposed to be negotiating peace are just too terrified to even step outside.
Exactly. Because, if you want to really grasp the magnitude of this shift, you have to look at how we used to define conflict resolution. For literally centuries, the negotiating table was this strict physical and legal sanctuary.
Almost a sacred space.
Right. Yeah, but not even for moral reasons. It wasn't about altruism or, shared humanity between enemies. It was purely functional, like going all the way back to antiquity. The herald or the envoy was given safe passage because, the alternative was just perpetual total war.
Right, because if you kill the messenger, the message stops.
The logic was completely mechanical. If the messenger dies, there are no terms, and the violence just runs until one side is completely wiped out. So the table, whether it was, a tent on a battlefield or some fancy wood-paneled room in Geneva, there was the one designated space where the mechanics of violence just paused.
It was like a mutually agreed upon fiction, I guess, that let an endgame exist.
The physical space was their armor.
But that armor is it's completely gone now. And to really understand how that sanctuary collapsed, I want to talk about the operational reality of the people caught in this today. Because there's this story about a man named Farhad that really it illustrates this perfectly.
Yeah, his situation is incredibly telling.
Right, so Farhad, he isn't some battlefield commander. He doesn't order airstrikes or command troops. He's basically a mid-level facilitator. He spent 20 years in the shadows of Tehran's foreign ministry, just dealing with the logistics of safe passage.
He's the infrastructure of diplomacy, not the architect of policy.
Exactly. He's the guy arranging the secure transport and the border clearances so the high-level diplomats can actually get to the table. But in the spring of 2024, that entire infrastructure is weaponized against him.
It's a terrifying scenario.
So Farhad is sitting in the back of this black armored SUV, idling on the congested outskirts of Baghdad. And the sensory details here are it's claustrophobic. He's clutching this worn leather briefcase, and inside it is a draft for a regional ceasefire, like actual granular concessions to stop a war.
But he's terrified.
Yeah, his hands are literally shaking, and it's not from the Iraqi heat beating down on the reinforced glass. He's shaking because of this acoustic signature. It's this low, sustained hum of a Reaper drone.
Right, which operates at an altitude where you can't even see it.
Exactly. It's invisible to the naked eye, but the vibration of it loitering up there, it's something he feels deep in his bones.
Because the psychological weight of that sound.
Yeah.
It just fundamentally alters the environment. I mean, it's auditory confirmation of surveillance.
It's absolute exposure. And Farhad looks up at his driver's sweat-stained collar, and he has this horrifying realization. His diplomatic passport, the documents in his briefcase, his 20 years of building trust, none of it is armor anymore.
He realizes he's bait.
Yes, he's a tethered goat. The peace process he's facilitating is just a lure to draw leadership out of their bunkers, and then the lead vehicle of his motorcade just vanishes.
Just completely erased.
Yeah, in a silent surgical flash of kinetic energy. The detonation is so precise it vaporizes the engine block before the sound wave even shatters the glass of Farhad's car. And he doesn't even scream. He just stares at this fine mist of debris settling over his briefcase.
Because in that split second, the whole paradigm shifts. The invitation to talk was just a coordinate for his strike.
The game itself is a trap. And for you listening to this, imagine realizing that the olive branch you're holding is actually a targeting beacon.
And the visceral paralysis that Farhad feels in that vehicle, that's the physical manifestation of a collapsed theoretical framework. What we're seeing is the total inversion of conflict resolution theory.
So, like academically speaking.
Well, the short-term tactical utility of taking out a high-value target has completely consumed the long-term utility of diplomacy. When a state launches a strike against a negotiator under the guise of peace talks, they are systematically dismantling the core psychological requirements for ending a war.
Which brings us to readiness theory, right?
Exactly. Readiness theory is this academic framework that challenges the idea that wars end just because people run out of bullets. It argues that stopping violence requires a highly specific cognitive state among the leadership on both sides.
And historically, raising the white flag triggered that state. It meant a pause. But if the white flag is a bullseye now, how does readiness theory explain the breakdown?
So, readiness theory says you need two mandatory psychological components for real negotiations: motivation and optimism. Motivation is usually what conflict theorist Williams Artman calls a mutually hurting stalemate.
Right, where both sides realize they can't win militarily, and the cost of fighting is just intolerable.
They're motivated to find an exit. But motivation alone isn't enough. You can want to end a war desperately, but you won't negotiate if you lack optimism. And optimism here isn't like naive hope. It's a calculated assessment that a settlement is actually possible.
You need to see light at the end of the tunnel.
Yes, and crucially, you have to establish working trust.
And working trust is very different from interpersonal trust. It doesn't mean you like the other side or think they're good people.
It's strictly utilitarian. It's just the calculated belief that the entity sitting across the table actually wants an exit and has the internal flexibility to stick to the terms. It's believing they aren't just putting on a performance.
So what happens to that fragile psychological environment when you introduce a targeted assassination?
It shatters instantly. If a key negotiator is liquidated by a foreign actor during exploratory talks, readiness is annihilated. The light at the end of the tunnel is violently put out.
Because the targeted group immediately assumes the other side is acting in total bad faith. Working trust hits zero.
The strike is undeniable empirical evidence that the table is a trap. Leadership can't convince their people that negotiations are viable when their peers are getting vaporized on the way to the summit.
We saw a pristine example of this with the Taliban in Afghanistan, right? Back in 2016.
We did. In the spring of 2016, there was this massive multilateral effort to get Taliban leadership to the table. Pakistan, China, the U.S., the Afghan government, they were all trying to set up pre-negotiation frameworks.
Real diplomatic signaling was happening.
Yes. But during this highly sensitive window, the leader of the Taliban, Mullah Akhtar Mansour, was tracked in Pakistan. And a U.S. drone strike vaporized his vehicle.
The timing there is what's so critical. They execute the strike exactly when channels were trying to establish working trust.
And the fallout was mathematically predictable under readiness theory. The assassination didn't destroy the Taliban's operational capacity at all. It just shifted their internal politics.
The exploratory talks collapsed immediately, I imagine.
Totally collapsed. The Supreme Council convened and appointed Mullah Akhtar, who was this hard-line cleric known for ideological rigidity, not military pragmatism. The group's posture shifted away from a political settlement and went straight to absolute escalation.
Wow, so they're radicalized.
Immediately, they executed a provincial attorney general and launched a massive suicide attack in Kabul that killed 14 security personnel.
Because the kinetic strike basically validated the most extreme voices in the room. The guys saying, don't trust them, were proven right.
Exactly. The targeted audience, which is the foot soldiers and operational commanders, they process a decapitation strike as proof that the enemy only speaks the language of violence. They abandon diplomacy because the assassination proves diplomacy is just a weapon.
It destroys the only off-ramp. Which brings up this profound paradox. If killing negotiators radicalizes the enemy, destroys trust, and prolongs the war, how did this become standard practice?
It wasn't always an acceptable doctrine.
Yeah, like there had to be some intellectual justification for states to normalize something that actively ruins conflict resolution.
And that shift actually happened in military theory during the late 20th century. To trace it, you have to look at aerial warfare theory, specifically a framework from the late 1980s by a U.S. Air Force strategist named Colonel John Worden.
Okay, Worden, what did he change?
He introduced parallel warfare. Before him, military doctrine like, going back to Clausewitz in the 19th century, viewed the enemy through mechanical metaphors. An adversary was a spider web or a house of cards.
It was all about physical friction and attrition.
Right. Strategic bombing in WWII or Vietnam focused on degrading centers of gravity. Bombing ball-bearing factories, cutting rail lines, attacking fielded forces. You applied enough mass and force until gravity caused the whole machine to collapse.
Newtonian physics applied to warfare, grinding the machine down part by part.
Exactly. But Worden completely rejected that mechanical paradigm. He said attrition was inefficient. He introduced a biological paradigm instead, known as the 5 rings model.
A biological paradigm.
Yeah.
So treating the enemy like a living organism.
Yes. He mapped the enemy into 5 concentric rings. The outer ring is the fielded military, the skin or armor, then the population, then infrastructure, then system essentials like power grids. But the absolute center, the innermost ring, was the leadership.
Brain.
Worden explicitly called the leadership the brain of the organism.
And that metaphor carries a very specific operational logic, because you don't need to destroy the skin or the muscles of an organism if you can just sever the brainstem.
That exact calculus births the modern doctrine of decapitation strikes. A biological body can theoretically survive without a brain, but it ceases to be a strategic entity. It can't process information or coordinate movement.
A heart without a brain is just a mechanical pump.
So the goal of warfare was no longer to slowly grind down mechanical parts. The goal was to bypass the outer rings entirely, penetrate the core, and induce instant paralysis by eliminating the leadership.
But, I mean, the danger of using a biological metaphor is infinite scalability, right? If every enemy organization is a biological organism with a brain, then the definition of a head becomes infinitely elastic. A nation-state has a head, a president, a supreme leader. But a regional logistics network also has a head. A financial cell-moving gray market funds has a head. A diplomatic delegation has a head. The kill list never ends because every subsystem has a brain.
And that elasticity drove the massive expansion of the targeting apparatus. It detached targeted elimination from the strict frameworks of nation-states and declared wars. Initially, in the post-Cold War era, they applied it to actual heads of state.
Like trying to target Saddam Hussein in the 1991 Gulf War.
Or the strikes on Slobodan Milosevic's residences during the 1999 NATO intervention in Yugoslavia. But once the premise that the brain is the ultimate target was embedded in the military, intelligence networks just started hunting for brains at every level of the hierarchy.
And by the War on Terror, this just morphs into high-value targeting, or HVT.
It was a massive doctrinal descent. They shifted from targeting dictators, commanding conventional armies, to hitting mid-level facilitators, obscure financiers, and back-channel diplomats in civilian environments.
Because under the organism paradigm, there's no functional distinction between a general commanding an armored division and a guy moving money from a safe house in a neutral city. They're both just vital organs.
But as these strikes expanded geographically, way beyond recognized war zones, states needed a new rhetorical framework to legitimize what they were doing. So they transitioned from general biological metaphors to highly specific medicinal and pathological metaphors.
Right. The language of the state morphs into the language of the surgeon.
Yes. Adversaries aren't enemy combatants anymore. They are cancers, viruses, or tumors that require surgical excision.
That is such a profound linguistic shift, because it actively strips the target of their legal personhood. A cancer cell doesn't get due process.
It doesn't have human rights. It can't appeal its eradication in an international court.
Right. It exists purely as a threat to the body, and the only response is destroying it.
And this pathological framing gives them a massive legal loophole regarding state sovereignty. When the US or Israel uses drones to strike someone in a country they aren't at war with, like Pakistan or Yemen, the diplomatic friction is huge.
So they use the medicinal metaphor to smooth it over.
Yeah. They frame the sovereign host nation as the patient. The targeted individual is the disease infecting the patient. So the kinetic strike isn't an act of war violating airspace. It's a defensive medical intervention to cure the patient.
They rhetorically invoke assassination into an act of healing. A state drops a laser-guided Hellfire missile onto a civilian highway and officially calls it surgery.
It's incredibly opaque.
And as statecraft gets this lethal, and the official narratives rely on this medicalized jargon to obscure the violence, the public's interpretation of geopolitics just fractures. When official press releases are just seen as performative misdirection, people look for alternative metrics for truth.
Which drives the massive migration toward financial prediction markets.
Right. It's the transition from political analysis to financial speculation. We are literally gamifying the kill zone.
Gamifying the kill zone.
And the mechanics of this gamification, they reveal how deeply desensitized we've become globally. The theoretical concepts of decapitation doctrine are being actively traded on digital exchanges by people entirely removed from the conflict.
Right, but people who just view it as data.
He's a 24-year-old quantitative analyst. He lives in a darkened apartment in London, lit up by 3 monitors. He's not trading tech stocks or commodity futures. He specializes in the algorithmic analysis of liquidation probabilities.
Event contracts.
Yes, event contracts. He is heavily leveraged on the probability that a high-ranking Iranian general traveling for back-channel talks will be assassinated before the weekends.
On his central monitor, he's probably watching a live, commercially procured satellite feed tracking vehicle movement.
And on the next screen, he's watching the live order book of a decentralized prediction market, like Polymarket. He watches the probability of the general's assassination jump from 14% to 62% in 10 minutes just because some anonymous capital bought up the yes shares.
And Julian feels a rush of pure adrenaline.
Yeah, because in this ecosystem, the diplomat in that vehicle is completely divorced from their humanity. They aren't a person with a family trying to end a war. They are a highly volatile, fluctuating asset. If the kinetic strike happens and the diplomat dies, the contract resolves to yes, and Julian makes a 400% return.
The chilling part isn't just the violence. It's the incredibly sophisticated financial infrastructure built specifically to monetize that violence.
It reduces the end of a human life to a data point on a candlestick chart, completely insulating the trader from the moral gravity. It's horrifying.
It is horrifying, but we have to draw a strict analytical distinction here about how these markets work. Modern decentralized prediction markets are fundamentally different from a theoretical concept from the 90s called assassination markets.
Right, Jim Bell's concept.
Jim Bell was a crypto-anarchist who proposed a system to bypass state power. He theorized an encrypted framework where people could anonymously crowdfund a pool of digital currency tied to the death of a specific public official.
Basically a decentralized open-source bounty board.
Exactly. The assassin would claim the funds by mathematically proving their involvement, usually by predicting the exact time of death in an encrypted file submitted beforehand. It was a direct, intentional incentive to pay a killer.
But modern prediction markets on the blockchain operate differently, right? They use binary yes-no or lev-die shares.
Right, and that binary system creates a really dangerous secondary effect that economists call the circularity problem.
Okay, let's unpack that for the listener. Imagine a market pool with $100,000 betting on a diplomat surviving a summit. If everyone believes he'll survive, the price of a live share goes up to, say, 99 cents.
But because it's binary and must equal $1, if live is 99 cents, the die share costs exactly 1 cent.
That mathematical inverse is terrifying, because the market's confidence in peace accidentally subsidizes the cost of violence. If die shares are practically free, a hostile actor or a private contractor could buy tens of thousands of them for pennies, execute the strike, and instantly cash out at $1 per share.
The market unintentionally creates a massive, cheap bounty funded by people betting on peace.
Wow.
Now, theoretically, that vulnerability is real. But modern prediction markets have self-correcting mechanisms. They are hyper-reactive to liquidity shifts. If an unknown entity suddenly buys massive amounts of cheap die shares, the algorithm adjusts the pricing immediately. The cost spikes, destroying the cheap bounty effect.
And I suppose if the probability of an assassination suddenly spikes, institutional actors like life insurance companies or state counterintelligence agencies will jump in.
They'll inject capital to buy the discounted live shares to hedge their risk, or stabilize the price. So these markets aren't efficient bounty boards like Jim Bell envisioned, but the underlying reality is the same. They provide a platform where the probability of state-sponsored death is continuously monetized.
And it's fascinating because these markets effectively act as decentralized intelligence agencies. Like, traditionally, government spokespeople stand at podiums and give these highly curated, performative statements about their absolute commitment to the peace process.
Managing public perception.
Right. But in the shadow of that rhetoric, anonymous actors with real money on the line are processing raw data. They're looking at commercial radar, tracking troop movements, monitoring signal intelligence from the dark web. They distill all that and put their capital behind the mathematical probability of a strike.
The betting slip cuts through the diplomatic theater.
It gives an empirical metric of what is likely to occur, completely independent of what the diplomats claim will occur.
And the predictive accuracy of these markets really highlights the current condition of the international order. Capital flows into assassination probabilities because traders are calculating risk in a world where the international taboo against state-sponsored assassination is effectively dead.
They aren't speculating on whether a state will risk violating the norm. The market has already priced in the fact that the norm doesn't exist anymore.
Exactly.
And that collapse represents a catastrophic failure of international law. The anti-assassination norm wasn't just a courtesy, it was a pillar of the post-WWII order. It's embedded in the UN Charter, Article 2.4, which prohibits the use of force against a state's territorial integrity. Executing a state official was universally recognized as an act of war. How did that deteriorate so completely?
It wasn't a sudden rupture. It was a very gradual, methodical process of routinization and bureaucratic legitimation over the last 20 years. During the Cold War, targeting an official outside a declared war zone was a severe violation of human rights and sovereignty. The word assassination had immense political stigma.
Even when intelligence agencies did it covertly, they officially denied it to preserve the norm.
Exactly. But the decay really accelerated after 9/11, driven by new legal authorizations and advanced drone infrastructure.
Right, starting with that strategic linguistic rebranding we talked about, shifting from assassination to targeted killings.
By changing the vocabulary, states place these operations within the legal paradigm of an ongoing globalized armed conflict. As drone tech got more precise, the practice became deeply bureaucratized, managed by kill lists and disposition matrices.
The legal justifications just kept expanding, and the breaking point for that legal elasticity seemed to hit in January 2020 with the U.S. drone strike on Iranian Major General Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad.
The Soleimani strike is a critical inflection point. It tested the absolute limits of the legal framework. The target wasn't a stateless insurgent. He was a senior military official of a sovereign state, killed in a third sovereign state.
And the administration's legal justifications were all over the place. First, they claimed self-defense due to an imminent threat. But when that intelligence was questioned, they pivoted to a retrospective justification.
Right, arguing he had American blood on his hands from past actions. But the most significant aspect of that strike was the global reaction. It was remarkably muted.
Allies urged de-escalation, but nobody explicitly condemned it as a violation of international law.
And in customary international law, silence is functionally equivalent to consent. If a major power executes a strike that stretches the boundaries and the international community doesn't impose consequences, a new precedent is established. The threshold of acceptable violence is permanently lowered.
Which brings us to the culmination of all this decay. The paradigm shift on February 28, 2026.
Yes, the joint U.S. and Israeli operation that successfully assassinated the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei.
That operation represents the total collapse of the sanctuary. The target wasn't a military commander visiting a forward operating base. It was the sitting head of state of a recognized sovereign nation.
It was the first direct, acknowledged killing of a sitting head of state, openly embraced by the actors who did it. But the real distinction isn't just his rank, it's the total absence of traditional legal scaffolding used to justify it.
Right, because before 2026, even when states violated the norm, they felt the need to construct complex legal arguments. Invoking Article 51, stretching the definition of imminent threat, that effort showed they still felt assassination was normatively problematic.
But after the 2026 strike, they justified it almost exclusively in moral terms, not legal ones. The official communications focused on his historical record, the oppression of civilians, and the technical sophistication of the strike. There was no real attempt to provide a binding legal basis under international law.
And for you listening, the danger of substituting moral justification for legal justification cannot be overstated. It dismantles the entire premise of an international order, because legal frameworks, even flawed ones, are tied to definitions and precedents. You can debate a self-defense claim in an international tribunal,
But a moral claim, asserting that someone is just bad enough to deserve extrajudicial execution, that's entirely subjective. It cannot be meaningfully contested.
exactly. It turns international relations into a high-tech vigilante system. The foundational rule of the global order shifts from mutual recognition of sovereignty to a raw calculus of power. The only law that matters is whether you have the drones to execute your unilateral moral judgment.
That is the terminal phase of the norm's decay, when the threshold moves from "is this legal" to "does this person deserve to die?" Well, the protective architecture of the state dissolves. Add in AI targeting and hypersonic missiles, and assassination goes from a covert tactic to a foundational instrument of foreign policy.
And, looking at how the legal shield was dismantled and how financial markets integrated this violence, we see the macro transformation of statecraft. But the macro perspective obscures the granular structural consequences for governance. If diplomacy is a lethal vulnerability, how does a targeted state actually function?
It generates what sociologists call a decapitation culture. It induces chronic systemic paranoia that corrodes the government from the inside out.
Well, let's talk about the daily existence of someone operating in this culture. There's a documented profile of a high-ranking official known as the minister. For over 3 years, the minister has not slept in the same physical location for 2 consecutive nights.
No permanent residence, no centralized office.
He lives in a rotating series of reinforced windowless basements with filtered air. He has literally forgotten what direct sunlight feels like because the open sky means sudden, televised erasure.
His environment is designed solely to negate the possibility of overhead surveillance getting a geometric fix on him.
Every time a secure phone vibrates, he flinches. The standard mechanisms of diplomacy are impossible. Going to a neutral hotel in Geneva induces absolute terror. It feels like walking to an executioner's block.
And his interactions with his family are restricted to heavily encrypted video links routed through proxy servers.
And even then, he's terrified that ambient acoustic data, like a generator humming in the background, could be isolated by an AI audio analysis program and used to triangulate his coordinates.
It's an existence reduced to the primitive mechanics of physical survival. The administrative functions of the state are completely subordinated to evading death.
He's too terrified to process information rationally. This profile proves that governance has devolved into a lethal evasion protocol. Diplomacy is dead because the people who hold the authority to negotiate are consumed by the logistics of waiting for the ceiling to collapse.
And when you analyze this bunker mentality through psychological profiling, you see how it destroys de-escalation. Historical case studies of authoritarian leaders under persistent threat, like Kim Jong-il in North Korea, show a consistent pattern.
Right. Leaders under chronic threat of decapitation often develop severe malignant narcissism and profound paranoia.
And the paranoia is functional. If they aren't hypervigilant, they get eliminated. The adaptation to the threat becomes their dominant operational mode.
And that hypervigilance alters how they interact with their own government. The paranoia metastasizes inward. They start viewing their inner circle, their generals, their intelligence chiefs as potential vulnerabilities or informants.
Because they know their coordinates have immense financial value. Their own subordinates might sell their location for a polymarket payout or a foreign bounty.
Which inevitably triggers purges. They eliminate competent administrators and replace them with sycophants whose only trait is unquestioning loyalty. Statecraft relies on delegating authority, but if you think communication exposes you to a strike, you can't delegate.
The leader hoards info, cuts electronic comms, and relies on analog couriers.
And when a leader refuses to communicate, the infrastructure of the state freezes. Moving supplies, managing the power grid, issuing military directives, it all just stops. The striking state doesn't even need to launch the missile. The looming threat of the drone induces strategic paralysis.
Furthermore, any form of political compromise is seen as a fatal vulnerability. If your reality is defined by the absolute certainty that the adversary is actively hunting you, making concessions is absurd. The leader's worldview shrinks to day-to-day survival. Long-term planning and diplomatic negotiations are abandoned entirely.
Going back to Worden's biological metaphor, The decapitation strategy basically acts as an induced autoimmune disease within the geopolitical organism. The lethal pressure on the brain causes the body to turn on itself.
The leadership dismantles its own command structures to hide in the shadows, severing connections to the rest of the body.
And when a state decentralizes that much, it triggers a Hydra effect. The central authority fractures into localized splinter factions, rogue militias, autonomous cells.
And those fragments are invariably more radical, more unpredictable, and completely impervious to diplomacy because there is no central authority to enforce a ceasefire.
Trying to cleanly sever the head just uncontrollably proliferates the conflict.
That is the ultimate catastrophic paradox of the decapitation strategy. It's marketed as a clean, surgical way to end a conflict by removing the brain. But the operational reality is that it shatters the organization into volatile fragments that make the conflict endless.
Synthesizing all of this, it reveals the absolute weaponization of the peace process. Normalizing the assassination of diplomats, stripping away legal consequences using medical rhetoric, and gamifying the violence on prediction markets, it has dismantled the architecture of international trust that was built over centuries.
The trajectory is mathematically rigid. By prioritizing the short-term tactical elimination of targets over the utility of the negotiating table, state actors have actively sabotaged conflict resolution. Subjective moral judgments are now used to validate extrajudicial killing on a planetary scale.
To really observe the mechanics of this landscape, we have to confront the terminal reality of the Westphalian system. The entire premise of a nation-state relies on the assumption that an entity is coherent enough and secure enough to make binding promises and keep them. But we occupy a reality now where a declared ceasefire is functionally just a designated window for logistical resupply and target acquisition.
The concept of a negotiation has been repurposed strictly as an intelligence-gathering protocol to verify leadership coordinates.
And in an environment governed by those rules, the core definition of the state simply evaporates. The global stage is no longer populated by a community of nations engaging in diplomacy. It has fractured into a chaotic landscape of hyper-paranoid, heavily armed factions, all of whom are only seeing at the table because they haven't yet calculated the exact coordinates required to annihilate the person sitting across from them. Something to consider the next time you see peace talks trending on your feed.